You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
What physical basketball
I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched it on YouTube.
Anyway.
I saw the game. I watched the game every time.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Moats. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Wiemuth. Welcome you to episode 56, NCAA Bracket 2026 with Andy Bottoms, recorded on the evening of Wednesday, March 25th, 2026. Andy, welcome and congrats on making it through another selection Sunday of Bracketology. As we often like to say, you feel like you guys are accountants just eagerly counting down the days until April 15th.
Yeah, there's a true feeling of relief when that part is done, and then I can just basically turn it off and get ready to actually enjoy the games as a viewer without having to feel like I've got to figure out, oh, this means this for this team, and here's how it affects the seed list, and transition very much more to just enjoying the tournament for everything that it is.
Exactly. And man, we just had a little guest come on there, Bob. Like, why did Bennett have to leave the camera?
Bennett decided to go back and say hi to his mother, but he did say hello and goodbye to everybody, including the two of you.
Okay, great.
Perfect. I was finally getting to see the brains behind the operation here, so that's good.
Yeah. That's the research and development department in every possible way. Yeah.
But Bob, does he still believe I live at the Ponderosa?
Yes, he does. He is utterly convinced that you are a resident of the Ponderosa in Philadelphia.
Yeah, sleeping under the salad bar. Yeah.
I can't think of a happier place on earth. Well, maybe my old bar in Columbus, maybe the 4th Street.
Just living off the drippings coming down from the dressings area.
So there's a chance he may pop back in. You never know. But so Andy, how did you feel like you did in the brackets this year? And I may have missed part of it, but I mean, I felt like as we were talking throughout the year, you were pretty much dead on as to where everything was going to end up.
I would categorize my overall performance in the bracket matrix as not very good. I would say that I think it's one of those where more and more people have started doing it. And I think it was one of those, I think Coach said the same thing about Delphi. It was probably, if it wasn't my highest score ever, it was one of the highest, but in terms of like actual place comparative to everybody else, it was really pretty low and pretty bad. I finished behind a certain individual who I will not name here. I texted Coach that I might be by law forced to retire from this, but he talked me out of it. So no, it was just kind of a little bit of an odd year in terms of a couple of things the committee did, which I know we're planning to talk about. So I don't want to totally blame my performance on that. Although I did concoct a text to Tonsoni earlier where after the first couple of days where I felt like performance of the tournament, you should not do this. This is not valid, but the performance of teams in the tournament really vindicated where I had them seated compared to where they ended up. So I was calling for a revision to the scoring where I was like, look, Ohio State should not have been an 8 seed over TCU. Those two clearly should have been flip-flopped, which is what I had. And based on the outcome of the game, that things should be better. Nebraska, I had them as a 3 seed. They've proven that was warranted compared to Virginia. So I haven't had any luck in actually getting traction on that, but I do think there's some interesting results and components to talk through the way this year's committee did it, even though I think overall they did a really good job.
Interesting. So while we bring up the committee, I'm going to mention this real quick. Hiring committees are now all the vogue. Today was another interesting day in the whole idea of, we're calling it a coaching carousel. I think it feels more like a coaching tilt-a-whirl, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
A bit of whiplash. Any thoughts on that? Like we're especially with the big one of the Rockefellers fell today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously was excited to see that Brad Stevens was not interested in the North Carolina job, that was, quickly dispelled. So that's important, really any key coaching search. But yeah, I think as you saw things unfold there over the end of the season, I know they had the Caleb Wilson injury, but it always felt tenuous with him. And I think had it not been for that great run in the NCAA tournament when they beat Duke twice, I think this probably would have happened earlier, but it was one of those where you couldn't really do it then. But I don't think anything that happened since then is out of the ordinary of what you saw from him over the rest of his tenure at Carolina. So probably was inevitable to some regard, in some regard, but delayed because of that NCAA tournament run where you really couldn't have made a change at that point versus, they lose that last game to Duke of that season and they don't perform well in the tournament. Then all of a sudden that's probably this might have happened 2 years ago or however many years ago that was.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially considering that they were, they were the number one team in the country, or definitely top, in that top 2%, his second season, and the bottom just completely fell out. And maybe the next year they got the 1 seed losing the Sweet 16, and the last 2 years have, as my Carolina fan friends say, it's just not been up to standard. And to me, the bigger story is less Hubert Davis and more the fact that you're looking at the Truman administration's the last time they actually have had to hire somebody outside the family. So to me, that's an interesting thing to be looking at here, is that we're going back to black and white televisions, and I only think Ponderosas were around back then. So I mean, the Carolina coaching family, not the restaurant, yeah, or because it was actually based on Bonanza. I think that they actually that was kind of the genesis of the name, and so the Carolina coaching family tree that lasted from Dean Smith working for Frank McGuire all the way to just now outlasted the entire chain of Ponderosas. Well, there's still a few floating around, like the one where Mike lives, but you know what I mean? It's like, so we're in this weird uncharted territory with North Carolina where it's like, how are they? And immediately when Brad Stevens breaks land speed records to say no, they're already talking Billy Donovan. And it's like, are there horse farms in Carolina? I know that there are. I'm pretty sure that there are in that area, right? So
they have to be. It's funny though. It makes you wonder. And bringing up that I think it was Tate Frazier on the podcast, the Basket Interview podcast he does with Eamon Brennan, that he was talking about that as a Carolina alum and a fan, just how long it's been since they've went through a legitimate coaching search to see how that plays out. And you look at their football hire of Belichick was splashy, but didn't 1 year sample didn't work at all. And so it's kind of interesting. It'll be interesting to see how they approach this hire in the aftermath of going a really splashy route with a big name that was coming from, totally different, side of things, how, or if that informs in any way the people that they're most interested for this job.
Yeah. It's like the Ford Motor Company didn't go until the 70s until they finally hired outside the family. I think it was just after the Etzel disaster, and they figured out, okay, now we actually have to move outside the family tree. So it is going to be a very interesting experiment at Carolina, and also possibly at Kansas, falling right on their heels if that if the rumors about Self's retirement is actually true. The thing I kind of like about it is all this, especially all the fans of other programs watching Carolina and Kansas, almost like hoping that they do not get a grade A coach. It was playing out almost like some checkoff play where everyone's gathering around to witness, which of the gilded families is going to get dropped from the social register and has to live like some miserable life as a gullery, basically like living in the gutter like everyone else. I mean, it's interesting because, we've all kind of gone through this exercise with IU's hires, and you're seeing it also with college football. But this is going to be really the interesting experiment. It's like, okay, can Carolina and Kansas get one of those elite hires, or is the theory that actually has been played out, what we talked about with our friend Bo, is the blue blood job a thing of the past? Is that going to play out? So it's going to be really interesting considering that two of these jobs are now open at the same time in the same market.
Yeah, and you've seen other blue blood programs get it wrong as they've gone through and had to make we don't need to look very far to talk through that. But even as you think through, hires at Kentucky and UCLA and things like that have, maybe not worked out in the way that people expected. And for some of these, neither of these has been in the market and had to go through that. And for Carolina, a really long time. Even for Kansas, Self's been there substantially long time. You had Roy before that. You just really, in some ways, if they knock it out of the park, then it's like you kind of shrug your shoulders as an IU fan and be like, okay, well, maybe it's not as hard as we said that it was. And then maybe it ends up that they have to go through a couple people before they invariably find the right guy or hopefully find the right guy at some point later down the line.
But more to come on that in the coming days and weeks. Before we jump in a little further here, wanted to just thank our title sponsor for not just this show, but the entire Back Home Network, Home Field Apparel, where you can find your best vintage-esque college gear, including the shirt that I'm wearing that has Hoosier the Bison on it, and among other T-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, hats, bomber jackets. I saw they just dropped a University of Kentucky denim jacket. For those of you who are, Gen Xers like us, who know that the coolest thing you can wear is a denim jacket, and if you have a UK, a spouse or an in-law or somebody that's a UK fan that, would look good, looking like John Mellencamp, I would, in the '80s, which, I always think of denim jackets. I always think of the American Fool album. You can check it out. You can check that out and much more at www.homefieldapparel.com or at their live location at Trax in Bloomington on Kirkwood.
Great. When we come back on X of Joe's, we'll jump right in and talk about the brackets of 2026 with Andy Bottoms coming up next.
When the final buzzer sounds in Bloomington, the conversation starts here. The assembly call is IU basketball. Live post-game shows, smart midweek breakdowns, and no empty hot takes. Jared Morris, Coach Brian Tonsoni, Andy Bottoms, and Ryan Phillips dissect lineups, sets, and recruiting so you know what really happened and what it means for the Big Ten season, March, and beyond. Join the live chat on YouTube, then catch the podcast on Spotify and Apple. Just search Assembly Call and be part of Hoosier Nation's most trusted post-game tradition.
Welcome back to X and Joe's. I'm Mike Wiemuth, joined by my friend Bob Moats and Andy Bottoms. So, Andy, something I always wanted to ask you, since usually when you and I are together, we're typically at a bar where it's very loud and we're trying to eat food and don't get the chance to necessarily talk shop, too much. So ironically, we have to do this like when we're actually on the air. So, but maybe to frame this conversation, I've always wanted to ask you this, maybe as a lead into the conversation about the 2026 bracket and, how the committee acted. But I've always wondered, do you believe that the committee, the selection committee, has a strong preference in how the final bracket actually should look? Or do you think that at the very least they're somewhat married to something like a process and have a degree of maybe indifference of who makes it or who doesn't based upon that process?
Yeah, I think in large part, as they've outlined the process and they've talked about it differently. They've done the different mock selection things where they've had media members come and different people. They kind of revitalized that this year after not having done it for a little while. And so I think they pretty much go through and talk through the voting process and how teams get voted in and what that process looks like. So I don't really think that there's too much of that. Now, I think as you get into some of the, last teams in the field type of thing, I think it's hard not to let certain other things creep in. I know the example that everybody will point to is last year when Carolina made it and Bubba Cunningham's the selection chair and some of those kinds of things. And I think you'd probably be, I don't think you'd be a conspiracy theorist to at least point out some of those things. And that even though people are asked to leave the room when certain conversations are happening, doesn't mean they're not having other conversations outside of that or some of those things, or it's like, hey, I know this guy and he, whatever. So I think that's really where you might get a little bit of that. I don't think that happens as much with the actual seeding of things. And I definitely don't think that happens with the matchups. I know a lot of times people will say like, oh, they wanted to see like this matchup and whatever, when in a lot of cases, it's the rules and procedures that dictate that in terms of who can play who when, and you can't have the top four, if there's the top 4 teams from a conference are all in the top 4 seed lines. They have to be in different regions and some of that stuff, and trying to keep with the geography. And so there's a guy on Bracketologist, Bauertology is the site. And on Twitter, he goes through every year after the bracket's built and kind of walks through, like, here's the seed list, here's how they built the bracket. And by and large, there's always a couple times where he's like, well, maybe they tried to do this here, but in general, like, you can walk through with the rules and say what it is. So a lot of those kinds of conversations around like manufactured matchups, I think, are the thing that is the least true of whatever beliefs that people might have about the process.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because it is something that there are very stringent guidelines, and I've always kind of thought about the last part of the bracket, like when we start talking about the bubble, and this year was it's been described plenty of times as a very soft bubble. Like, there were lots of, how many teams at the end were really kind of sitting there that had a shot, including Indiana, which I think most of us in the fan base were a little surprised that they were even made the first 4 out at 18 and 14, 2 losses, with some of the losses and some of the wins, or so even without the number of quality wins I think that most teams would be looking at. But it's almost kind of like the end of the Indy 500, like that last qualifying runs at Indy to fill out the back row. It's very similar because in so many ways that bubble conversation doesn't really have a whole lot of what you would call relevance. Although I'm saying that this year, when we have Texas sitting as an 11 play-in seed, sitting in the Sweet 16, so I mean, it's one of those types of deals where it's like, yeah, the bubble conversation is, it's really interesting to me. Also, kind of looking at it from that end, that you had a lot of teams this year that just seemed to be kind of in, I would say, from 20 to 50 in KenPom, there was a lot of there was just a lot of, I almost call it parity in so many respects, because you had a lot of teams in that range that was kind of hard, I think, sometimes to tell a big difference from.
Yeah, there's always sections of the seed list and the bracket that are a struggle to me. And this year it was kind of like the 8 to 10 seed-ish range. And then a little bit the bubble, which we can talk about in a minute. But I think there's just certain things where it just depends on what you value and what that particular committee values, where there's kind of some interchangeable teams. I joked about Ohio State and TCU earlier, but they were a little bit like symptomatic of, to me, what this year's committee seemed to value, and the way things have started to trend, I feel like, over the last couple of years, where there's this whole kind of notion of the selection is very much based on wins above bubble, and the seeding is directed a bit more, not entirely, by the quality metrics. So the KenPoms, the Torviks, the BPI, and things like that. And so to me, the Ohio State TCU is kind of a good juxtaposition of those things. Like, TCU didn't have great quality metrics, the predictive metrics, whatever you want to call it. I'll probably use those interchangeably, but they did have a lot of really good wins. They had a bad loss to New Orleans at the beginning, but they had beaten Wisconsin I think they beat Wisconsin on a neutral floor, Florida on a neutral floor, had some big wins in the Big 12, and they ended up getting seated behind an Ohio State team that had really good predictive metrics, but until the last week or so of the season, a couple weeks of the season, had really not beaten anyone, and ultimately didn't beat anyone that great outside of Columbus until they beat Iowa in the Big Ten tournament. And so this year's version of, both those teams worthy of selection for different reasons, but Ohio State ends up getting seeded higher than TCU. And I think there's different areas you can kind of go down and look at that. I would, I kind of look at Virginia being a 3 over Nebraska as a potential one of those. There's lots of those, little areas there where you have some of that. And it seems like the committee over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about wins above bubble. That really is, how you get in, which makes sense because it should be what you accomplished. And then I think to a certain extent, it makes sense to see people based on the quality metrics as you look at if you're really looking at how good the teams are and what betting lines are usually attached to or aligned with. Makes sense in some ways, but I do think there's a little bit of the nuance in the middle of how to evaluate some of these teams versus, have you actually beaten enough good teams to be there? That maybe felt a little bit lost to me, and perhaps that's excuse making for most of the seed. Most of the things that I missed by a seed line were those kinds of arguments. And I think committees in the past tended to be more swayed by some of the big wins, and maybe this one a bit less so.
Yeah, and you said, Andy, before that the committee. I don't know how long they've done it. I know it's more of at least a recent iteration where they actually kind of do a preview of the brackets. They kind of at least give a brief look in of sort of, I guess what they're thinking, or at least, what their preliminary placement is going to look like. When they do that, can you glean from those initial previews what you think is actually being prioritized with what will eventually happen on Selection Sunday?
I have tried to. I don't know that I have succeeded. I have tried to over the course of time. I'll usually look at those and try to kind of take a snapshot of the different metrics as of that time period. And so typically you're going to find that the teams, and I don't know that I did it this year, I was trying to look through while we were talking kind of the, maybe teams that had the highest net that wasn't mentioned or things like that. But like for this year, for example, of the top 16 teams that they revealed, 15 of the 16 nobody was ranked lower than 17th in wins above bubble. The only team that was higher than that was left out was Alabama. They were 11th at the time, and they were the first team they mentioned that was just outside of it. Okay. So you do look at some of that stuff. I think in some of the ways with the top teams, I think I would get more out of it if they talked about who was on the bubble as of that time, to be honest, because that's really where you're, kind of splitting hairs between some of those kinds of things, because everybody doesn't look great at that point. And so you're trying to figuring out for those teams what they value would probably be more helpful than the top teams, where it's like, okay, well, I could quibble here and there that maybe this team should be a 2 or 3, but they all have really good things. And so the chair at that point is basically giving you, if they make comments on the teams, which I usually try to jot down, it's usually, oh, they have this many wins or they rank here and whatever. It's all really good stuff. You get to the bad stuff when you get to the teams on the bubble. And then I think I'd glean more from it that way. So that's kind of where I say I've tried. I don't know that I've succeeded in some of the cases, but that's at least the way that I have approached it.
Gotcha.
So you had mentioned earlier, and you were kind of talking a little bit about Nebraska versus Virginia, and I was a little surprised to see Virginia hitting a 3 seed also, just based on, and even though the record was a better case for Nebraska in many respects, kind of walk through that kind of thought process. And I know the results have kind of proven that also with there being Nebraska winning and getting into the Sweet 16.
Yeah, it is hard. As much as I jokingly did it earlier, so I can't really say that you shouldn't do this, but it's hard to kind of retrofit how the teams performed in the tournament with, well, this means you definitely made the wrong decision. But
right.
With a team like Virginia, gaudy record for sure, but had 2 cracks at Duke, couldn't do it even when they were pretty banged up. And the ACC, for it being better than it had been before, still, not great. Some of their best or wins away from home was Texas. Well, they're a bubble team. Louisville, who gaudy predictive metrics, but didn't really beat a lot of great teams. So they really just beat Ohio State on a neutral court. So I don't think they had hardly any wins against teams that were single digit seeds, other than I think they beat Miami twice, once at home and once on a neutral court, and that might have been it in terms of teams that they beat who were single digit seeds. And so I think that's where it gets hard. And they had a good season. The metrics were really good. And at a certain point, I get a little bit of that, where if you're the committee, some of these big conferences, you have to become more reliant on that, because you're not guaranteed to play the best teams in your conference as much. And so I think you end up becoming more reliant on some of those things as your arbiter of who's better. And Nebraska, on the flip side, had not played well down the stretch, although they have, it used to be the case that your last 10 games or 8 games or 12 games, something was on the team sheets. That's not the case anymore. But if you look at least at what they were able to do, winning at Illinois is better than any win away from home that Virginia had. And even some of the, they won at Ohio State as opposed to on a neutral court. They beat some decent teams at home in terms of beating Michigan State. They beat they lost to Purdue at home, but beat Iowa at home. So Nebraska was probably maybe not the greatest example of that, but they were, to me, that was kind of like the next team in line, where this team has more quality wins, seems to have played better against the better competition that it's played, and at least has something to show for those games. And does that matter? And so that's where, as I do this going forward, probably need to give a little more credence to some of the quality metrics that maybe they can offset things that in the past they couldn't, either because they didn't exist or weren't as mainstream for the people on the committee.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point, Andy. And also just thinking about, that this trend we've heard about in basketball in recent years is the idea of basically trying to beat the computers as a strategy by particular teams, programs, and coaches. I guess in the academic sense, it's similar to preparing for the test versus like actually learning, the subject. I'm curious, in what you've seen, at least in this year's tournament and the selection, do you think that the strategy of basically trying to sort of beat the metrics, essentially like blow out, teams as much as you can, keep your starters in with 2 minutes left when you're already up 30. Have you seen, at least in terms of how the committee went about things this year, did they reward that kind of behavior, or was it, just a wash?
I think if it was rewarded at all, it was more from a seeding perspective. It wasn't awarded from a selection perspective. And I say that in large part because it's become so dependent on the wins above bubble, which that doesn't factor margin of victory in. It's really just who you beat and kind of assigning a value to those teams. So if you schedule a bunch of terrible teams, even if you beat them, your overall wins above bubble is not impacted that much because it's basically like, it's measuring what the average bubble team would be able to do. So you're not incrementally for those games getting a whole lot. So in that regard, I talk about the reliance on that. I think I looked the only team in the top 47 in wins above bubble that didn't get in was Auburn, who was 44th. Now they just had too many losses in my estimation, but they were a heavy talking point. And so that's really one where, and I think that a similar thing was true, like North Carolina ranked well in that the year before. And so that's been pretty predictive in terms of who's going to make the field now. So that's kind of where I say, I don't think it's helped in that regard to load up on those teams, because you really put a lot of pressure on yourself to beat good teams in conference play if you completely loaded up your non-conference with just those kinds of bye games. Where it does potentially help you, though, is in some of those cases where if it really did matter from a seeding perspective and you look at some of those predictive metrics. And so I'll throw out, trying to think of another team, like St. Mary's was a hard one to seed this year, and can be a lot of years, right? Like they had very few high-end wins, but their metrics were really good. They ended up, I had them as my first 8 seed. They were kind of in the middle of the 7 line for the committee. And in reality, they had beaten, I think they might have, I don't know if they beat Gonzaga at all, but they beat Santa Clara. They had some decent wins, but their metrics were really good. And so some of that, they can just boat race teams, even though they don't play really fast. They just play a style that I think just gets other teams to kind of give in certain ways to do some of that. And so that really benefited them in that case. And like I said, the Virginia, to a certain extent, had better metrics than Nebraska, even though they hadn't beaten as good a team. So I think it's helped people a little bit there as things seem to trend a little bit more toward those kinds of predictive metrics being a bigger factor in seeding. But I don't think that's an avenue for people to get in. But it is a case where the net itself that everybody references definitely has more of a predictive lean. So you can definitely inflate that as you go through and do it, but it doesn't necessarily help what seems to be driving selection for the most part.
Well, it's interesting because you bring up the West Coast Conference with both St. Mary's and Gonzaga. I'm looking at Gonzaga right now, and yeah, St. Mary's beat them in the last game of the regular season by 11. But other than playing, and again, they had some decent wins against Kentucky being one, UCLA being another, semi-away, semi-home, but. I think it kind of the conversation for conferences like West Coast, where you have Gonzaga, St. Mary's, and everybody else. And this year we had 2 teams from the MAC that got in, and Miami was, as I said, I said on our last show, I'm not sure about Miami. Mike took the position of Miami probably definitely deserves this. They deserve their I would say they deserve their 11 seed. But then the debate around it of, well, who do you play and who's going to schedule you? And the smaller schools are saying, well, nobody wants to schedule us. And then I think it was Matt Painter jumped out and said on the opposite, well, we'll put you on the schedule. You come in, you play at our home gym, we'll pay you the check, and you'll see where you stand. They did that with Oakland this year. And I think that it's going to be kind of a question moving forward with some of, when we start talking buy games, and they're there for a reason. They're there for, I think, high major teams to fine tune some things. But I also think on the backside of it, it's also there. It's also, if you're the low major team, you get a nice payday. You see where you stand. Maybe you get an upset. Maybe you show playing close. Oakland played Purdue very close, very closely this year. But it's also, I think, a problem when you start talking about just building your schedule. As they start building their schedule for next season, there is a risk reward component to this, isn't there? That on one hand, if you're a Miami and you went ahead and you scheduled, Ohio State this year, for example, or even Xavier, and you lose to them, would that have impacted you? In that equation. And I think that they're, even with the money you get from the game, and even with that area, it was kind of an interesting conversation, I think, throughout the sport of, well, what do we do with the 200 plus teams that aren't high major teams? And there's only so much space for a Gonzaga, only so much space for a St. Mary's. And would you even argue that maybe Gonzaga wasn't really a 3 seed this year, even though the metrics and maybe some of that other stuff were in there? I mean, I really don't know the answer to that question. It's just more of a legit kind of looking at this in retrospect. Did it work out did it work the way it was supposed to?
A couple interesting things you said there. I'll kind of give Gonzaga as a little bit of a contrast between this year and last year, and then I can get into the Miami thing. So Gonzaga last year was a team that was pretty hard to see. They always schedule pretty aggressively, I think, because they're insulating themselves from, well, if the WCC is not as good as it's been at times, or if I take a loss, I got to really go out. And so they did that last year, and in large part didn't beat a lot of those teams. I think they beat Baylor in the opener. They didn't. Lost to Darren DeVries's West Virginia team in the first game in the battle for Atlantis. They lost to Kentucky. They lost to Connecticut. They lost to UCLA. So they lost a ton of those games. But from a predictive standpoint, they were terrific. Mm-hmm. And so I think they ended up with an 8 seed because the committee was kind of like, well, in my view, and I don't remember what I had them last year. I'm sure I could look it up, but not quickly. But you could. It's like, do you split the difference? Because I don't think they beat as many good teams as they needed to, but I'm also not sure that I want to set them up to play against a 1 seed in the second round as they did that. Now they lost to Houston, but they only lost to Houston by 5 as they went through and did that. And so they end up top 10 in KenPom at the end of the season and were an 8 seed. And so this year, I would guess the way this year's committee did it, it's not that they would have been a 3 by any means, but I think they would have been a little bit higher. In terms of the Miami thing, I mean, their selection, the wins above bubble really helped them. I think they were 37th in the final. And there was a huge gap, as big a gap as anybody between that and their predictive metrics, which were I want to say their net was in the 60s. Their average quality metrics were pretty high. And so, their all metric rank, at least going into the last day of the season, was 63rd. So that takes into account all of the resume metrics and the predictive. So the predictives were all super high on them. So now, little did we know how poorly coached SMU would appear to be in that game. That was appalling to me in a variety of ways, but it was awesome to see Miami do well. I felt bad because I was I think I was talking to Tonsoni and I was like, man, it was really awesome to see how they play in a fun style, but I couldn't help but thinking SMU is just terrible. And what are they doing at practices? The closeouts were terrible. Everything was bad. But anyway, I think the wins above bubble in that case really helped Miami because otherwise in in the absence of a metric like that, or even any of the resume-based metrics, you would just look and say, you know what? Sorry, you didn't beat anybody. You lost to a bad team in the opening round of your conference tournament, and I'm not going to feel bad about leaving you out. And I don't think they deserve to be left out by any means. And so I do think that's where some of the reliance on wins above bubble is helpful for a team like that. Doesn't mean they don't have to try to schedule. But I do think you see a lot of teams, Painter coming out on that. He certainly is one. Like, they played Akron this year, who was the projected winner of the MAC and who ended up winning the conference tournament. And I think they typically do that. Kansas does that a lot because they're really trying to play. Traditionally, they've played some of the best mid-majors and done a good job of scheduling in that regard, knowing this isn't really going to hurt us. I think Alabama's done some of that in recent years. And so there are some teams who will do that. There just aren't a lot of teams who will do that. And, I don't know what Miami was offered to do and not do to be able to come to some of these games. But I think you also see in this area, you've got a couple things at play. One is you've got rosters that are almost entirely new in multiple cases. Do I want to set myself up to potentially lose something? Again, I don't know that anybody thought Miami was going to be so good at the beginning of the season that they were going to be scared of them. It's not like they were picked to finish at the top of the MAC. And that may have actually played against them of like, hey, if I felt confident you were going to be toward the top of your league, maybe I would have played you. Again, I have no idea who would and wouldn't. I know there were some people that did FOIA requests to try to get some of that stuff, and I didn't read through all that. But and then I think the other thing you've got is coaches who, newer in their tenure, don't want to lose a game like that. So again, to the extent that they were afraid of Miami or worried about losing to them, I can see them not getting that game. But I do think at least there's a little bit of a safety net through the wins above bubble that can help some of these teams that may not get all the games they want. But even if you took, had they scheduled a bunch of Missouri Valley teams as an example, like, you still could rack up some good points, if you will, in your wins above bubble in that scenario, even if you can't maybe play the absolute best of the best.
So you're saying just go play USI, would have made sense, or maybe not USI, but definitely hitting up, let's say, an Indiana State or some of the other schools that are kind of in that valley, in the valley. Bradley would be a good example of that too, I would think. Hitting them up.
Yeah. Andy, do you think it's ironic? I mean, you've mentioned wins above bubble a few times, and obviously that's like one of the new metrics that's kind of come into our vocabulary recently. Do you think there's a little bit of irony in the fact that if you look on the wins above bubble listing this year, Auburn is 0.14 on WAB, while Texas and SMU both have negative signs next to their wins above bubble. So, like, how much is that an actual, I guess, measure of the bubble, if it actually, at least this year, seemed to kind of have some contrary instances?
Yeah, I still think it does a pretty good job. I know there are people who the one that shows up on the NCAA sheets is all based on the net, versus I think Torvik has his own wins above bubble calculation that's a little bit different than that. And I've heard some people say they prefer one to the other. I've not dug in any way, shape, or form to know which might be better or worse. And I think ultimately, like, what that tells me is if Auburn isn't one game over 500, they get in the tournament and one of those teams doesn't. Or if SMU doesn't make sure everybody knows that BJ Edwards would be available for the game when in fact he would not be available for the game. I think you may have seen a different outcome for them. I think it was just probably too much for the committee to, in some way, set the precedent that you can finish one game over 500, lose some of the games that Auburn lost, and still get in. But I have no doubt that if they'd found a way to get 2 games over 500, that they would have been in. So I think it was actually a pretty good reflection of where things were, because SMU, from an injury perspective, was, when you factor that in, was probably right there on the cut line. So I think it does a pretty good job of getting the teams, when you look at the resumes, the teams that are right around that mark it kind of makes sense based on what they had accomplished and the holes in their resume, because the teams on the other side of that were the wins above highest that weren't in the field was Auburn, as we said, then San Diego State, who was right there, IU, who was, despite what we may have felt we saw with our eyes, was right there, Oklahoma was there, Virginia Tech was there. Like, all those teams kind of had a few good wins, but enough warts to say, they would be maybe hard to select. So I think if you look at the teams right around that like cutoff of who made it and who didn't, and who was right around that, just a little bit above 0, just a little bit below, maybe somebody could say it's self-fulfilling as you look at some of the teams and the way that they were seated, but it felt pretty right to me in that regard.
Yeah, it's interesting. It may be, and I agree with you. I think the metric itself is reasonably accurate and fairly predictive. I think it's almost just sort of the irony of the naming of it, the fact that it implies that it tells you, okay, if you're above the bubble, then clearly you've made the tournament, and if you're below the bubble, clearly you've not made the tournament. So so maybe it's just they have to tweak the language a bit to
Yeah, it's funny if you could force it to. You'd have to figure out a way to handle like when auto bids would get different ones from there. So because you could, if you knew for sure how many at-large, well, how many at-large bids you have, but if you kind of knew the math of where the bids were coming from, you probably could force it to say, all right, that you're the 0 of the last team in and stuff like that. But I think that fluctuates enough in a given year where you had, Akron winning the MAC as an example, or I guess VCU winning the A10, where that's kind of like shifts it a little bit in terms of how many teams can get in when you have those bid stealers, and like where you'd shift that cutoff, the kind of you're above or below 0. But it is a good point, but maybe it's wins near bubble or something like that.
Yeah.
So to everybody here, did anything really kind of floor you on a surprise after the first weekend? I mean, I could maybe argue High Point, maybe Iowa would, I think could be considered a surprise, but I mean, it's fairly common to see that 1-9 upset. You see those happen. I mean, was there really any, I mean, for the most part, we look at this bubble and we see a lot of, all the 2s survived, all the ones except Florida survived. I think most of the 3, I mean, pretty much the 3s and the 4 survived too, other than maybe one exception here and there, right? I mean, there really wasn't anything that kind of floored me other than, or Texas jumping through the way they did.
Yeah, plucky underdog Texas, you just can't. But no, I nothing. The Iowa one to me was the one that was most surprising, and I think anytime you see a team that plays a style that they do that can lead to a little bit of that variance where you limit possessions and all those things. And I think I forget what it was. I'm probably gonna get this a little bit wrong, but another good. I don't work for the Basket Under Review people, I promise. But Stats by Will and Jim is another one of their podcasts that's really good. And I don't remember if it was Will Warren or Jim Root who brought up the average possession length in that game for each team, and it was basically like if you did the math that Iowa had the ball for 7 minutes more than what Florida did. And so I think you can see that in some of those scenarios where you just have that contrast in styles and the one wins out a little bit. And even that seemed like Florida was going to be able to overcome that at the end. So that was really the one that was the most surprising to me. And I think part of that can be a function of the committee did a pretty good job of seeding to the extent that they're using more of these predictive metrics for seeding. You would presumably then have fewer of those kinds of upsets. And then obviously I think you have the general consolidation of talent more toward the higher end of the teams, which limits some of those opportunities. But you saw a little bit of that with High Point, although as someone who took Wisconsin on the first day of Jay's knockout pool, that was not really everybody in the bar that I was at was going crazy. And I was like, really Wisconsin? So, I rare that I want to align myself in that way, but that was the situation I was in. So, you still saw a little bit of that. I thought the VCU comeback was good and kind of vindicated the fact that felt like they probably should have been in regardless of winning the A10, even though it became clear that they weren't. And so you had some of that. And I think what it sets up for is, for the most part, what should be some pretty good games over the course of the next few days when things tip back off tomorrow.
Well, and I go back to a couple 3 years ago when we had basically it was UConn who went through, I believe, as a 3 seed and winning it all against San Diego, who was definitely a lower seed, and brackets all were breaking all over the place. And since the portal in particular, player compensation, all those factors are in, which is it's harder and harder again for those mid majors or programs that have that one guy. like if Lamar Wilkerson's still playing at Sam Houston State, he can make an impact in a game, in a game, a first round tournament game. You know, you can see that being in a 4-13 game where Lamar as a 13 seed, his team just, you know, rusts on him a little bit, and they were able to just kind of blow the doors open. But just about that Iowa game, also, I think you brought up a good point about just the tempo variance, because one thing Ben McCollum and Mike and I, we were talking about this back and forth for a while now. His mindset of we're going to take transition basketball out of the equation because we wanted to be and we're going to slow our offense down, so it by nature slows the other team's defense down. Really just throws everybody off. Like the timing, when you start seeing Florida starting that game missing alley-oop dunks, that for me was kind of like a big warning sign of Florida's not really adjusting. And I agree. I kind of thought, okay, once they got past the under 4 and they kind of cruised a little bit, they were going to figure out how to score the basketball just enough. But at the end of the game, it's like, even though they had the lead, a couple empty possessions where they missed shots, and Sturtz makes a beautiful kick out to Fulgeras, and he hits the 3-pointer from the corner. Again, I think everybody in the gym figured Bennett Sturtz was going to shoot that basketball, and he had a bad game for him. He had a bad game that day. So, it's really kind of something with Iowa that, that's that sort of variance. But again, it's an exception, not the rule. And I think there were a lot of people who look at the NCAA tournament, they think that the upsets are supposed to be the rule, when in reality, in the landscape we're in now, it's kind of doing exactly kind of what it's supposed to do, which is setting up Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games that are supposed to just be on fire, and then a really good end of the tournament.
Yeah, I think what you end up with in some of the cases is you have these teams upset them, and then it's like, well, the next round of games, this round is terrible because you don't have this. So, like, I think people want it both ways. I think it's good enough when you have enough upsets sprinkled in and some buzzer beaters and that kind of drama. But if you have too much of that, then I think it waters down future rounds to the point when that would give people something different to complain about, which, I mean, people do like to complain about things. So, in that regard, maybe it's great. But I just think it would just be a different argument of like, well, this is this good for the sport and whatever. So like I said, I sit back and look at these games where you got, I think two teams left that are seated higher than a 6, and say these games should be really good. Really each one of them, because your seeds that are higher than that are the Iowa, which is kind of that interesting story that has played 2 games, decent games against Nebraska already. And then you got Texas, who tons of talent, maybe underachieved in certain ways during the season, but it's, really should make for a good weekend of games. At least I hope so.
Andy, before we move on to our final closing segment, I just want to ask this question to you. This is more maybe a personal question. Do you, as a bracketologist, do you get, let's say, some undue pressure from family, friends, and coworkers around this time of year to actually fill out their brackets for them?
Yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what that means. And I try to tell people that being able to predict where teams are going to be seated and placed and stuff like that has very little to do with being able to pick who will win. And in some cases, I don't think this is true anymore. I used to have probably more free time to watch some of the games in previous years than I do now. In some cases, it was actually a detriment because you felt like you knew. It's almost like you knew too much, or at least you thought you knew too much. So you could overthink virtually every pick. So knock on wood, I've actually done pretty good in the bracket that I've done this year, but I don't think that is in any way a function of bracketology. But I will get asked a lot for like, oh, I should ask for your help in my bracket. And I'm like, no, I don't know that that's a good idea for you based on previous track record of performance. So yeah, definitely a misunderstanding. There was even a time that I was doing this that some guy like had me on. I think it was when I was doing stuff for, it might've been the site that I wrote for Jared, Midwest Sports Fans. And some guy like wanted me to come on the radio and like go through the bracket. And like legitimately, I tried to explain like what I was doing. He was like, no, still come on. And so it was like, we went through the whole thing and I'm like, I don't know how I did, but probably not very good. And he, for however long I talked to him, had no idea that what I had, was really thought my bread and butter was at the time had nothing to do with picking the actual winners. So,
I would say in future years, it's always good to kind of Google for those of you who fill out brackets, and mine is kind of sitting in the middle of the pack like it usually does. Because like Andy said, you overthink them sometimes. You do that frequently, especially looking at it from a coaching standpoint. Like, okay, I missed St. Louis completely. I thought that was going to be a much different outcome. Not, but watching that dismantling was fun. Was fun to see from my perspective, because it was fun to see on Josh Scher's team play as well as they did. But I think you can always Google the percentages as to what percentage of 1 seeds get past, what percentage of 2 seeds get past, what percentage of 8 9s end up. I mean, that's a 50-50 toss up. But like you start getting into 7, 6, 5, 6, 7, you're in that 60% range. So if you're picking all the 10 seeds to win, the math doesn't really math necessarily. So, again, looking at it from a standpoint, if you really kind of look at the analytics, there's the seeding has really kind of played out over the years of, for the most part, the math kind of works in that, it works in a certain way where it's, it does, it's not a definite by any stretch of the imagination, but like I got Purdue in my Elite 8 because I looked at that and I said, I just don't see this. I don't see BYU taking them out. And I had BYU instead of Gonzaga in the Sweet 16, and it ended up being Texas. So, and nobody in my pools brackets even thought Texas was even a possibility. So, out of 26 brackets, nobody had Texas.
Yeah, exactly. All right, when we come back, we'll wrap up with Andy Bottoms next on X's and Joe's.
Hoosier Nation, want a smarter take on IU sports? Then check out Crimson Cast, your go-to podcast for Indiana football, basketball, and beyond. Hosts Galen Clavio and Scott Caulfield bring you game previews, instant reactions, history, and context to make Indiana sports come alive. From the biggest moments on the field to the storylines shaping the future, Crimson Cast keeps you informed and connected. And after years of saying bring back the Bison, IU actually did it. So if IU listens to Crimson Cast, maybe you should too. Just search Crimson Cast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Bob Moats with Mike Wiemuth and our good friend from the Assembly Call and the Back Home Network, Andy Bottoms, talking more about the NCAA tournament. So as we kind of wrap up here, where do we kind of see this thing going in the future? I guess would be kind of my thought. Is that are we getting to the point where the analytics are so good that maybe the debate becomes less emotional and much more rational?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's somebody, I think it was Graham Doran that I follow, who also does bracketology, and it was either him or Kerry Miller. They do a podcast together about it, and it kind of said, like, you can see a future of a couple years from now where there is no bracketology because it's either an algorithm or it's all data driven and different things like that. Luckily for me, I don't rely on this for a significant source of my personal income. So that would not be, it would probably be a net positive for me in terms of freeing up time, quite honestly. But so I could see some of that. I think at least from I feel like we're pretty close to that from a selection standpoint, quite honestly, where I think there's validity in that from a selection standpoint. I think what you lose in some of these cases is a little bit of the nuance, whether it's injured players or different things that may have happened over the course of the season that maybe can't be captured by the numbers. And that's a little bit of, and even some of the quality metrics. That's why you gave some of those examples where it's like, well, should that really mean that this team is seeded higher? Like, shouldn't there be a good way to blend that combination of, hey, the metrics look good, but you actually beat good teams too. Mm-hmm. It feels like that shouldn't get completely lost in the shuffle in that way. And I think, again, the committee's still trying to balance that out somewhat, even though, to my view, it shifted a little bit more this year than perhaps previous to what the metrics would say from a predictive standpoint. But, it wouldn't necessarily shock me to see that happen and say, hey, look, if there's a couple nuances we miss, that's fine, but there's really not lessens a little bit of the debate. I don't know that the NCAA does, cares that much about the debate. They're going to get attention on the tournament. And I think this year, though, I will credit the Keith Gill, who was the committee chair. I thought he did as good a job as any that I can remember of really being able to come out and be pretty transparent about what they cared about, what they didn't. I thought that started when he did the top 16 reveal that they did, and really continued in terms of what he did after the fact. So I think that helps everybody involved, whether that's coaches, administrators, fans, things like that. So if it doesn't go to a more automated solution, I guess, then I would like to see, I think a lot of the things that this committee did are good things to carry forward. And from a bracketology perspective, it's kind of up to me and to other people who are doing that to adjust to what they're doing. So I can definitely see that happening, though, to go that route. And it would give people something to track during the year to kind of say, hey, look, as of today, I know that I'd be in, or I know that I wouldn't. That would probably, from a network standpoint, give additional talking points. So if you did something like that, as I think has been proposed, at least at some times in the past, I think John Gassaway maybe once upon a time had talked about that. So I think there's maybe would add intrigue in a different way to the sport too.
Yeah. But you think about it, it probably would take away some of the drama of it, because, we tend to look at the bracketology, especially as you're getting into February, March. It does have the quality of like a reality TV show, like, who's getting the rose or who isn't, who's making the, the last four in, or who's in the first four out. And yeah, and also just the fact that, if you went to, let's say, algorithms and computers exclusively, you don't have anyone to yell at, because, it's easier to kind of get mad at a person like Bubba from Chapel Hill versus, some anonymous computer sitting down in the NCAA's, computer room. So I think that in some ways, I think you're right, Andy. Like the accuracy would increase, and maybe the transparency of the process would obviously improve. But I do think that I do think there's an element of it in the sense that you would lose some of the drama of the fact that, okay, these are somewhat being impacted by humans, and we like to get upset about human decisions and human frailty. So I think it's it's a very interesting balance of kind of contending with what the committee has.
But it shifts the drama away from that sort of qualitative anecdote, back and forth, people talking at each other about this, to actually games. Like if you can pinpoint a game for Auburn, say Auburn has to win this game to get into the tournament, or to get in. This win would put them at the positive of the wins above bubble. This game is essential. Then it's kind of like going back to the Indy 500 qualifications. It's a matter of, okay, this is the last day of the season, the last game they can play. This is maybe it's a conference, second round conference tournament game, that all of a sudden it's like this would put them safely into the tournament. This puts this driver safely in the field. It puts the impetus on the competition, not on the external factors, where we're all just kind of talking for a month about who's on the bubble, and, well, this is a critical game for Ohio State and Indiana. We know that, but the question is, even if Indiana wins at Ohio State, they probably do get in this year. If Ohio State loses, they're still probably in the tournament as well. It's not like they're bumping somebody out. So you get more of that bump they feel of the Indy 500 than you actually do kind of a reality TV show. And maybe it's because I don't watch a whole lot of reality TV.
Yeah, I think some of the things it would solve, and I know this year the committee really seemed to take into account the Sunday conference championships more, almost to give the big, hey, I hear what you're saying that these don't count. Well, screw you. I'm going to give it extra weight this year. And so I think there was a bit of that, but having it be more algorithm based you can't miss, you couldn't miss that and things like that. And I think we've seen through college football some of the merits of these different approaches, right? With the BCS versus now. Now, the flip side is now you have somebody come on who really does a poor job, or at least this past year generally did a poor job of articulating what they actually did and what mattered time over time. So that goes back to Mike's, people want somebody to get mad at. Well, it was pretty easy to get mad at this guy who can't form complete thoughts around how teams are. And we'd certainly miss out on announcers who don't really understand bracketology, throwing stuff out about that. So, lots would be lost if we went to that route. But I think maybe aspects of it become more that way. But I think you'd lose something for sure, where it can't account for everything. And maybe you'd make the argument that in college basketball, you've got enough data points where you don't need to, whereas in college football, you don't have enough data points because of the number of games. But it's an interesting debate, and then I'm sure it'll evolve a bit more. And who knows, if they expand the tournament field, then maybe it takes on an even different look than it does today. Not to get into, we don't have time to get into that discussion, but doing that, what does that make it look like in terms of those things? So it'll be interesting to see it evolve for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Andy, for coming on. We really appreciate it. Always good talking to you, man.
Yes, happy to do it. Always good to talk to you guys. And in comparison to the last time that we spoke in person, I actually have a voice. So to some, that's a positive. Not to all, but to some.
We feel bad for you that day.
Yeah, we did. rough time for it to go out too.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks to Bob Thompson for the music and sound of the show, and John Ringer of ringdesign.com for the logos and look of the show.
And this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including the Assembly Call, Doing the Work, the Dribble Drive, Big Red Carpet, Raise the Flag, Sideline Stories, Football Weather, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and backhomenetwork.com. So until next time, I'm Mike Wiemuth.
I'm Bob Moats.
Take care, everybody.